The Dallas morning sun beamed through the glass ceiling of Union Station, casting long shadows across the busy platform. It was just another Thursday for most of the hurried commuters, but for 73-year-old James Wilson, every day was a small battle. The old veteran gripped his worn leather satchel in one hand and used the other to steady himself on his walking cane, a gift from his grandson last Christmas. James had woken up earlier than usual that morning. His old war injury always bothered him more when the weather changed, and the spring air had brought a damp chill that settled deep in his bones. Still, he had an appointment at the VA hospital he couldn't miss, so he'd put on his best button-up shirt, combed his silver hair neatly to the side, and pinned his small 101st Airborne Division badge to his jacket lapel, a habit he'd maintained for over 50 years. "Excuse me," James said softly as he navigated through the crowd. Most people moved aside with understanding nods or small smiles. An elderly woman even patted his arm gently as he passed, a silent acknowledgement of their shared struggle with mobility. The station clock showed 7:45 a.m. The train would leave in 10 minutes. James tightened his grip on his cane and quickened, his pace as much as his bad leg would allow. The Vietnam jungle had left its mark decades ago when shrapnel tore through his knee during a rescue mission that had earned him the Purple Heart. The doctors had done their best, but some wounds never fully heal. "The eastbound train to Fort Worth will depart from Platform 3 in 8 minutes, announced the overhead speaker, causing a surge in the crowd's movement. James found himself caught in a stream of business people, students, and daily commuters, all flowing toward the waiting train. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead as he struggled to keep up. His breathing grew heavier and a familiar tightness gripped his chest. Not his heart. The doctors had checked that thoroughly. But anxiety that sometimes ambushed him in crowds. Too many people. Too much noise. Too similar to memories he'd spent a lifetime trying to forget. "Deep breaths, Jimmy boy," he whispered to himself, using the nickname his platoon had given him all those years ago. One step at a time. The boarding platform was packed when he reached it. Young professionals tapped impatiently on their phones. College students with earbuds bobbed their heads to private rhythms. A mother hushed her crying toddler. And there, just ahead, stood the open doors of the train, his gateway to a much-needed seat for his aching leg. James approached the train steps carefully, aware of the small gap between platform and train. At his age, a fall could mean broken bones, hospitalization, or worse. Behind him, he could hear the impatient shuffling of feet and clearing of throats, but he focused on the task at hand. Safety first. That's what he'd always taught his own kids. "Come on, old man." A sharp voice cut through the morning bustle. "Some of us have actual jobs to get to." James turned slightly to see a man in his 40s, dressed in an expensive-looking gray suit, designer watch glinting on his wrist. The businessman's face was set in lines of frustration, his eyes fixed on his phone screen even as he spoke. "I'm moving as fast as I can, sir," James replied evenly, the discipline of military service still evident in his response to rudeness with courtesy. He turned back to the steps and lifted his bad leg carefully onto the first one. The pain shot through his knee like lightning, causing him to wince visibly. Behind him, the impatient sighs grew louder. "For God's sake," the businessman muttered, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "It's like being stuck behind a tortoise." James pretended not to hear as he gripped the handrail tighter. Just 2 more steps, he could make it. He always had. What happened next occurred so quickly that James barely had time to register it. As he lifted his cane to place it on the next step, he felt a hard shove from behind. The businessman had pushed past him, knocking into his shoulder, with enough force to make the old veteran lose his balance. As James stumbled sideways, the businessman delivered a sharp slap to his upper arm. "Move it or lose it, Grandpa," the man sneered as he brushed past and disappeared into the train car. James caught himself against the doorframe, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. The cane clattered to the floor of the train and his satchel slipped from his grip. Several passengers gasped. A young woman covered her mouth in shock, but no one moved to help. Time seemed to slow down as James steadied himself. He could feel his cheeks burning with humiliation. In that moment, he wasn't a decorated veteran who had saved 3 of his fellow soldiers under heavy fire. He wasn't the respected high school history teacher who had inspired hundreds of students over a 30-year career. He was just an old man too slow for the modern world, being punished for his frailty. He bent down slowly to retrieve his cane, wincing at the pain in his knee. A teenage boy finally stepped forward and picked up the fallen satchel, handing it to James with downcast eyes, perhaps ashamed of his initial inaction. "Thank you, son," James said quietly, straightening his jacket and the small division pin that had somehow stayed in place during the commotion. With as much dignity as he could muster, James entered the train car. He saw the businessman already, seated, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. Several passengers averted their eyes, uncomfortable witnesses to cruelty they had done nothing to prevent. James moved toward the back of the car, looking for an empty seat where he could recover his composure and massage his throbbing knee away from judging eyes. What James didn't notice, what nobody on the train yet realized, was that seated in the far corner of the car was a man watching the entire scene unfold with intense interest. A man with a distinctive beard and penetrating eyes that had become famous worldwide. A man whose very presence would soon change the entire atmosphere of the morning commute. As James lowered himself into an empty seat, breathing deeply to calm his racing heart, he had no idea that his difficult morning was about to take an extraordinary turn, one that would begin with the words, "Excuse me, but I believe that gentleman deserves an apology." The train doors closed with a soft hiss. The businessman smirked, thinking the matter was over, but Chuck Norris was just getting started. The train lurched forward, beginning its journey with a gentle sway. James Wilson gripped the edge of his seat, still shaken from the encounter. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached into his satchel for his handkerchief to wipe the sweat from his brow. 50 years after the war, and his body still remembered how to respond to threats, heart racing, muscles tensing, senses heightened. Only now his aging body couldn't keep up with those instincts like it once did. A young woman sitting across from him offered a sympathetic smile. She looked like she wanted to say something, perhaps offer comfort, but instead turned her attention back to her book. James understood. People didn't want to get involved these days. He'd seen it before, the bystander effect they called it in psychology. Everyone assumes someone else will step in, and in the end, nobody does. At the front of the train car, the businessman who had shoved James was now loudly talking on his phone about some important deal, his voice carrying through the quiet car, like he owned the space. Several passengers shot annoyed glances his way, but nobody said anything. That's how bullies win, James thought. They act like they're untouchable, and too often, they are. "Would you like some water, sir?" James looked up to see a teenage boy holding out a small bottle. It was the same kid who had picked up his satchel earlier. "Thank you," James said, accepting the water gratefully. "That's mighty kind of you." "My grandpa was in Vietnam, too," the boy said, nodding toward James's division pin. "He doesn't like to talk about it much." "Most of us don't," James replied, with a sad smile. "Some memories are better left in the past." The boy nodded like he understood, though James knew he couldn't possibly. Not really. How could anyone understand what it was like to carry ghosts for 50 years? To jump at sudden noises? To wake up sweating from nightmares that never really faded? From the corner of his eye, James noticed movement. A man in the far corner of the train car had stood up and was making his way toward the front. There was something about his walk, confident, purposeful, yet completely at ease. James had seen that walk before, in men who knew exactly what they were capable of and had nothing to prove. The man was in his early 80s but moved with the fluid grace of someone decades younger. He wore simple clothes, jeans, boots, and a black button-up shirt. His beard was neatly trimmed and his eyes scanned the train car with quiet intensity. Several passengers did double takes as he passed, followed by whispers and wide eyes. "Is that?" the teenage boy whispered, his voice trailing off in disbelief. James squinted, trying to place the familiar face. Then it hit him. Chuck Norris, the martial arts champion, the movie star, the man whose tough guy reputation had spawned 1,000 internet jokes. But there was nothing funny about the expression on Norris's face as he made his way toward the businessman at the front of the car. The train car fell silent. Even the businessman seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, glancing up from his phone call with a frown. "I'll call you back," he said abruptly into the phone, ending the call just as Norris stopped directly in front of him. For a moment, neither man spoke. The businessman cleared his throat, uncomfortable under Norris's steady gaze. "Can I help you?" the businessman finally asked, trying to sound confident, but his voice cracking slightly. "I believe you owe someone an apology." Norris said, his voice surprisingly soft yet carrying throughout the now silent train car. The businessman blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" "The gentleman you pushed and slapped while boarding," Norris clarified, gesturing toward where James sat. "He deserves an apology." The businessman's face flushed red. "Look, I don't know who you think you are. I'm someone who believes that how we treat our veterans matters," Norris interrupted, still speaking calmly. "And how we treat our elders defines us as a society." A woman nearby pulled out her phone and began recording. Others followed suit. James felt his face grow warm, embarrassed to be the center of attention. "That pin on his jacket," Norris continued, pointing toward James, "is from the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. My brother served with them. Those men jumped into hell on earth to protect everything we take for granted." The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I was just in a hurry," he muttered. "I have an important meeting." "More important than basic human decency?" Norris asked. The question hung in the air. Several passengers nodded in agreement. "I watched you deliberately push past him," Norris continued. "I saw you slap his arm and call him Grandpa, like his age makes him less worthy of respect." Norris leaned forward slightly. "Where I come from, we stand up for those who stood up for us." The businessman stared at his expensive shoes. The entire train car seemed to be holding its breath. "Well?" Norris prompted. "Fine," the businessman said through gritted teeth. "Sorry," Norris shook his head. "Not to me, to him." He gestured toward James. "And like you mean it." James felt dozens of eyes turned toward him. Part of him wanted to wave it off, to say it wasn't necessary. He'd endured worse than a shove and a slap. But another part, the part that still stood at attention when the national anthem played, the part that had taught history to teenagers for 30 years, knew this moment mattered. The businessman hesitated, then stood up. The train swayed as it rounded a curve, causing him to grab a handrail for balance. Slowly, he made his way back through the car until he stood before James. Up close, James could see the man's face more clearly. The expensive haircut, the carefully trimmed beard, the signs of a life spent in comfort. But there was something else there too, a flicker of shame in his eyes. "I'm sorry," the businessman said, his voice lower now, "for pushing you, and for what I said. It was wrong of me." James looked up at him, this stranger who had humiliated him just minutes ago. He'd faced worse enemies and found forgiveness. That was the thing about surviving a war. It taught you what battles were worth fighting and when to lay down arms. "We all have bad days," James said simply. "Just remember, everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about." The businessman nodded, looking genuinely chastened. He opened his mouth as if to say more, then closed it, uncertain. "What's your name, son?" James asked. The businessman looked surprised at the question. "Robert," he answered. "Robert Keller." "Well, Robert," James said, extending his hand. "I'm James Wilson. Now we're not strangers anymore." Robert hesitated, then shook the offered hand. The train car remained silent, but the tension had shifted. Something was happening here. Something small but significant. Chuck Norris watched the exchange with approval. But as James would soon discover, the martial arts legend wasn't finished teaching lessons on this morning train ride. Not by a long shot. As Robert returned to his seat, visibly humbled, Norris made his way toward James. The old veteran straightened his back instinctively, a habit from his military days when meeting someone of importance. "May I join you?" Norris asked, gesturing to the empty seat beside James. James nodded, suddenly finding himself speechless in the presence of the legend. He'd seen every episode of Walker, Texas Ranger during his retirement years. Never in his wildest dreams did he imagine meeting the man himself, much less having him come to his defense. As Norris sat down, the other passengers watched in fascination, phones still recording. This ordinary Thursday morning commute had just become the story they'd tell for years to come. "That pin," Norris said, nodding toward James's division badge. "My brother wore one just like it." James touched the pin reflexively. "Screaming Eagles," he said with quiet pride. "I was with them from 69 to 71. Norris nodded, his eyes reflecting respect and something deeper, understanding. "My brother never talked much about his time there, but I know it changed him." "It changes everyone," James replied simply. Neither man seemed to notice that the entire train car was watching them, hanging on every word. For the moment, they were just two men connected by the invisible threads of shared experience, one who had served and one who had loved someone who served. What happened next would turn this chance encounter into something even more extraordinary, a moment that would remind everyone on that train about the meaning of respect, the power of standing up for others, and the unexpected ways heroes can appear when we least expect them. The train continued its journey, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks providing a steady backdrop to the remarkable scene unfolding in the third car. What had begun as an ordinary morning commute had transformed into something extraordinary. A moment when strangers became connected through an unexpected act of kindness and respect. Chuck Norris sat beside James Wilson, two men from different worlds finding common ground in their shared values. The other passengers watched in fascination, some still recording on their phones, others simply witnessing with quiet attention. Even the usual sounds of a commuter train, phone notifications, whispered conversations, rustling newspapers, had fallen silent. "I was heading back from a veterans event," Norris explained to James. "We raised money for service dogs for vets with PTSD. James nodded appreciatively. "Those dogs make a world of difference. My buddy Tom got one last year. Changed his life." "Is that what brought you out today?" Norris asked, gesturing to James's neatly pressed clothes. "A VA appointment?" "Yes, sir," James replied. "Regular checkup for this old leg. Took some shrapnel near Kisan in 69. Norris's eyes showed recognition. "Tough fighting there." "Toughest I ever saw," James agreed quietly. Their conversation paused as the train slowed for a station stop. A few passengers exited, but surprisingly, no one in their car moved to leave. Several people who had been standing took newly vacated seats, but their eyes remained fixed on the unlikely pair, the aging action star and the Vietnam veteran. The businessman, Robert, sat stiffly in his seat, occasionally glancing back at them. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by what appeared to be genuine discomfort. When the train started moving again, he stood up and made his way back to where James and Norris were sitting. "Excuse me," Robert said, his voice considerably humbler than before. "I wanted to say something else." He took a deep breath. "My father was in Vietnam too. He came back different, angry. We never really connected after that. I guess I've carried that anger myself without understanding it." James looked up at him, surprised by this unexpected confession. "That doesn't excuse how I treated you," Robert continued, "but I want you to know I'm truly sorry." Before James could respond, Norris stood up. "Mind if I say something to everyone?" he asked, looking first at James, then at Robert. James nodded, curious. Norris turned to face the train car full of commuters. At 83 years old, he still commanded attention with his presence alone. The passengers who had been surreptitiously recording now did so openly, phones raised high. "I don't usually step into strangers' business," Norris began, his voice steady and clear. "But what I saw today touched on something I feel strongly about. It's about respect, not just for our veterans, though they've earned it many times over, but respect for each other as human beings." He gestured toward James. This gentleman served our country when many turned their backs. He sacrificed years of his life and came home with wounds both visible and invisible. And 50 years later, he still carries himself with dignity. Several passengers nodded in agreement. An older woman wiped tears from her eyes. In my martial art schools, Norris continued, the first thing we teach isn't how to fight, it's respect. Respect for yourself and for others. Real strength isn't about pushing people around or being the loudest in the room. It's about lifting others up, especially when they're struggling. Robert stood nearby, listening intently. Norris turned to include him in his gaze. And real courage? Real courage is admitting when you're wrong and trying to make it right, like this gentleman just did. Robert looked down, uncomfortable with the praise he clearly felt he didn't deserve. We're all in a hurry these days, Norris said, looking around the train car. Always rushing to the next meeting, the next appointment, the next whatever. But in that rush, we're missing the chance to see each other, really see each other, as people, not obstacles. The teenage boy who had given James water raised his hand tentatively. Mr. Norris, could you tell us about your brother who was in the 101st? Norris's expression softened. Aaron was my younger brother. He served 2 tours in Vietnam. He was the bravest person I've ever known, not just for what he did there, but for how he lived after, with kindness despite everything he'd seen. A silence fell over the car as everyone absorbed his words. Then, from the back of the train car, an elderly black man stood up. He wore a Korean War veteran cap. I served too, he said, his voice carrying a slight tremor. Korea, 1951. Sometimes feels like people forget that one. No, sir, not forgotten, Norris responded with respect. Not by those who understand the sacrifice. Another man, middle-aged with a prosthetic hand partially visible beneath his shirt sleeve, spoke up from his seat. Iraq, 2003. First wave in, 1. By 1, other veterans in the car began to identify themselves. A woman in her 40s who'd served in the Gulf War. A young man recently returned from Afghanistan. Like a roll call across generations, they acknowledged each other with nods of understanding. James watched in amazement. They had all been sitting there in silence, carrying their stories, invisible to each other until this moment. The businessman, Robert, looked around the train car with new awareness, as if seeing his fellow passengers for the first time. His eyes lingered on the veterans who had spoken up. My father never talked about Vietnam, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not once. When I was a kid, I found a box of his medals in the attic. When I asked him about them, he locked them away. I never saw them again. James nodded sympathetically. For a long time, we couldn't talk about it. The country didn't want to hear it, and we didn't want to remember it. Easiest for everyone to pretend it never happened. But that silence cost too much, Norris added. My brother used to say the heaviest weight was the stories he couldn't tell. The train began slowing again as it approached another station. This time, several passengers would need to exit, including Robert. This is my stop, he said, gathering his briefcase. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to James. I run a financial services firm. If there's ever anything I can do for you, please call me. I mean that. James accepted the card with a nod. Thank you, Robert. As Robert moved toward the doors, he stopped and turned back. Mr. Norris, would it be all right if I took a photo with you and Mr. Wilson? Not to post online or anything, just for myself, as a reminder. Norris looked to James, who nodded his agreement. The teenage boy who had given James water earlier volunteered to take the photo. As the 3 men stood together, Robert in his expensive suit, James with his division pin, and Chuck Norris in his simple black shirt, something unspoken passed between them. The boy snapped several photos and handed the phone back to Robert. Thank you. You, Robert said, looking at both men, for more than just the photo. The train doors opened and Robert stepped onto the platform. As he walked away, his posture seemed different, lighter somehow, as if a burden had been set down. After the doors closed and the train began moving again, Chuck Norris returned to his seat beside James. Where was I? He asked with a small smile. Ah, yes, I was telling you about the service dog program. But before he could continue, a little girl who had been sitting quietly with her mother a few seats away approached them timidly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely audible over the train's noise. She looked about 7 years old, with bright eyes and missing front teeth. "My grandpa was a soldier too, but he's in heaven now. Mom says he was a hero." James smiled gently at the child. "I bet he was." "She drew something for you," the girl's mother explained, coming up behind her daughter. When she saw what happened earlier, "Would it be okay?" The little girl held out a folded piece of paper. James took it and carefully opened it to find a crayon drawing of a soldier standing tall beside an American flag. In a child's uneven handwriting were the words, "Thank you." James stared at the simple drawing, feeling a lump form in his throat. After 50 years, so much had changed about how veterans were treated in America. When he returned from Vietnam, there had been no welcome home parades, no thank you for your service, just silence and averted eyes. And now this child. Norris watched as James carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his shirt pocket close to his heart. "That's going in a frame as soon as I get home," James said, his voice slightly husky. The train continued its journey, but something had shifted in that car. Strangers were talking to each other now, sharing stories, making connections. Veterans who had sat in anonymous silence were being thanked, their experiences acknowledged. All because one man, a legend known for his toughness, had shown that true strength comes from standing up for others. As the train approached the next station, no one realized that this extraordinary morning was far from over. The simple act of kindness that had started on this train was about to ripple outward in ways none of them could imagine. Not even Chuck Norris himself. The train pulled into the VA Medical Center station 30 minutes later. By then, the atmosphere in the third car had completely transformed. What had started as a tense confrontation had blossomed into something unexpected, a rolling reunion, of veterans spanning generations with Chuck Norris as the unlikely catalyst. James gathered his satchel and cane, preparing to exit. His appointment at the VA hospital was in 20 minutes. To his surprise, Norris stood up as well. "This is my stop too," Norris explained. "I'm meeting with the director about that service dog program I mentioned." As the doors opened, James stepped carefully onto the platform, mindful of his bad knee. This time, however, there was no impatient pushing or rude comments. Instead, the other passengers waited respectfully, some even offering a hand, which James politely declined with a smile and a nod. "I can manage," he assured them. "Been doing it for 50 years now." Once on the platform, Norris fell into step beside James, or rather, adjusted his own normally brisk pace to match the veteran's measured gait. Behind them, several other passengers from their car followed at a respectful distance, phones still occasionally raised to capture this unexpected moment. "You've got quite a fan club," James commented with a nod toward their followers. Norris chuckled. "I think they're more interested in you than me these days. I'm yesterday's news." "Somehow I doubt that," James replied. As they approached the hospital entrance, a young security guard did a double-take at the sight of Chuck Norris walking alongside an elderly veteran. The guard straightened up immediately, his hand almost moving to a salute before he caught himself. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, holding the door open. Inside the lobby, the effect of Chuck Norris's presence was immediate. Staff members whispered to each other. Patients sitting in waiting areas nudged their companions and pointed discreetly. A nurse dropped a clipboard. "Mr. Norris," called a well-dressed woman hurrying across the lobby. "I'm Dr. Linda Chen, hospital director. We weren't expecting you for another hour. I caught an earlier train," Norris explained, shaking her hand. "And I'm glad I did. I had the honor of meeting Mr. James Wilson here." He gestured toward James. 101st Airborne, Vietnam. Dr. Chen turned to James with genuine respect. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Wilson." "Likewise, ma'am," James replied. "James has an appointment," Norris added. "But I was hoping afterward he might join our meeting. His perspective would be valuable." James looked surprised. "I wouldn't want to intrude," Not at all, Dr. Chen assured him. We're discussing new programs for veterans, including expanded transportation services for older vets who have trouble getting to appointments. Your input would be invaluable. Before James could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught their attention. A group of people with professional cameras had arrived. The local news crew, apparently tipped off about Chuck Norris's visit to the VA. Mr. Norris, called a reporter hurrying toward them. Could we get a statement about your donation to the service dog program? More surprising were the people behind the news crew, several passengers from the train, including the teenage boy, who had given James water and the mother with the little girl who had drawn the picture. We told them what happened on the train, the boy explained, slightly out of breath, about how you stood up for Mr. Wilson. The reporter's eyes lit up at this unexpected angle. Is that true? Would you both be willing to share that story? James looked uncomfortable with the attention. Norris noticed his discomfort and stepped slightly forward. Only if Mr. Wilson is comfortable with it, Norris said firmly. And not here in the lobby. Perhaps after his appointment and our meeting. Dr. Chen intervened smoothly. We have a conference room you could use, and Mr. Wilson, we can move your appointment up so you won't have to wait. The next hour passed in a blur for James. A nurse escorted him to his appointment while Norris spoke briefly with the reporters, asking them to respect James's privacy. The doctor examining James's knee was more thorough than usual, perhaps knowing that his patient would be sitting down with Chuck Norris afterward. Taking good care of yourself, Mr. Wilson, the doctor noted, reviewing his chart. Blood pressure's much better than last visit. Been walking more, James explained. When the weather permits. After the examination, an aide escorted James to a conference room where Norris and Dr. Chen were already deep in discussion with several hospital administrators. On a large screen, a presentation showed photos of veterans with service dogs. Ah, James, please join us, Norris said, standing to pull out a chair for him. For the next 30 minutes, James listened as the group discussed programs to help veterans, not just those from recent conflicts, but aging veterans from Vietnam, Korea, and even a few remaining from World War II. They talked about transportation challenges, mental health services, and ways to build community among veterans who often felt isolated. The hardest thing for many of us, James found himself saying during a pause in the conversation, is feeling forgotten. Not just by the country, but sometimes by the system that's supposed to help us. The room fell silent as he continued. I'm lucky. I can still get around on my own, even with this bum knee. But I've got buddies who can't leave their homes anymore. Some don't have family nearby. Their war ended 50 years ago, but they're still fighting battles every day. Just different ones. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly why we're expanding our home visit program, but transportation remains a huge hurdle. What if you had volunteers? Asked a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see the teenage boy from the train, standing there looking slightly embarrassed at interrupting. Sorry, he said quickly. They told me I could wait here for the interview. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. That's all right, Dr. Chen said. Come in. What were you saying about volunteers? The boy stepped into the room nervously. Well, I'm getting my driver's license next month. Lots of kids my age are looking for volunteer hours for college applications. What if there was a program where we could drive veterans to appointments, like with training and everything? Chen and Norris exchanged impressed glances. That's actually a wonderful idea, Dr. Chen said. We'd need to develop protocols, of course, but connecting generations that way could be powerful. I'd sign up, the boy said with certainty. What's your name, son? James asked. Tom Baker, the boy replied. My grandpa was Stanley Baker, 101st, airborne like you. He hesitated, then added, He died last year, that's why I noticed your pin on the train. James felt a jolt of recognition. Wait, Stan Baker? Tall guy, scar on his left cheek? Tom nodded, eyes widening. You knew him? We were in the same unit for a while, James said, his voice growing softer with memory. He saved my life once, near Hamburger Hill. Never got to thank him properly after we rotated home. Tom's eyes filled with tears. He never talked much about Vietnam. Most of us didn't, James acknowledged. but he was one of the best soldiers I ever knew. The room fell silent again, everyone sensing the weight of this unexpected connection. Finally, Norris spoke up. "I think this is what today has been about," he said thoughtfully. "Connections we didn't know were there, respect that crosses generations, stories that need to be shared." Dr. Chen nodded. "And perhaps a few new programs for our veterans." She turned to Tom. "Would you be willing to help us develop this volunteer driver idea? We could use a young person's perspective." Tom's face lit up. "Yes, ma'am. Definitely." The news crew was ushered in shortly afterward. James had initially dreaded the interview, but with Norris beside him and young Tom now sitting on his other side, he felt more at ease. He even found himself sharing parts of his Vietnam experience that he rarely discussed. "The thing people don't always understand," he explained to the reporter, "is that respect matters more than pity. We don't want special treatment, just the dignity of being seen as who we are, not just what we went through." The reporter nodded, clearly moved. "And Mr. Norris, what made you speak up on the train this morning?" Norris thought for a moment before answering. "I was raised to believe that if you have the ability to help someone, you have the responsibility to do so. It's not about being a celebrity or a tough guy. It's about being human." As the interview concluded, Dr. Chen made an announcement that surprised everyone. "Inspired by today's events and with Mr. Norris's generous contribution, we're establishing a new program called Respect Rides. It will connect volunteer drivers with veterans needing transportation to medical appointments. And our first volunteer," she added with a smile, "is young Mr. Tom Baker here." Cameras flashed as Tom shook hands with Norris and James. The reporter asked them to stand together for a photo. 3 generations united by respect and service. They posed. James glanced at the boy beside him, seeing echoes of his old friend Stan in the young man's features. He thought about how a difficult morning that had started with humiliation had somehow transformed into this moment of connection and purpose. Later, as they prepared to leave the hospital, Norris placed a hand on James's shoulder. "This isn't over, you know," he said. "What happened today, it's just the beginning." James raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Norris smiled. "You'll see. Some things have a way of multiplying when they're shared." James didn't understand then what Norris meant, but as he would discover the next day, their story was about to reach far beyond that morning train and this small VA hospital. It was about to touch lives they couldn't imagine, including those of a businessman named Robert who was already making plans of his own. James Wilson woke up the next morning to the insistent ringing of his telephone. He reached for it groggily, wondering who would be calling at. He squinted at his bedside clock. 7:15 a.m. "Hello?" he answered, his voice still rough with sleep. "Mr. Wilson? This is Diane Kelly from Channel 8 News. I'm so sorry to call this early, but our morning show would love to have you on today. The video of what happened on the train yesterday has gone viral overnight." James sat up straighter, suddenly wide awake. "What video?" "Several passengers recorded what happened with you, Mr. Norris, and that businessman. It's all over social media. Over 2 million views already." James ran a hand through his silver hair, trying to process this information. He didn't even have a social media account. "I don't think I'm up for a TV appearance," he said finally. "I appreciate the offer, though. Would you at least be willing to speak by phone? People are very moved by what happened." Before James could answer, his call waiting beeped. Then again, and again. By the time he politely ended the conversation with the news station, he had 6 more calls waiting, all from different media outlets. His doorbell rang as he was brewing his morning coffee. Looking through the peephole, he was surprised to see his neighbor, Mrs. Harriet Powell, an energetic widow in her 70s, practically bouncing with excitement. "James Wilson, why didn't you tell me you met Chuck Norris?" she demanded when he opened the door. "My granddaughter showed me the video this morning. You're famous." By midday, James had unplugged his home phone and was seriously considering putting a "No Reporters Please" sign on his front door. He sat in his favorite armchair, trying to make sense of how a simple train ride had spiraled into this. His cell phone, rarely used except for emergencies, buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mr. Wilson, it's Robert Keller from the train. Please call me when you get a chance. I have a proposal I'd like to discuss." James hesitated, then dialed the number. "Mr. Wilson, thank you for calling back," Robert answered immediately. "I've been thinking a lot about yesterday." "So have I," James admitted, "though I didn't expect it to become such a big story." "That's actually part of what I wanted to discuss," Robert said. "After our encounter, I did some research about the challenges veterans face with transportation and healthcare access. Then this morning I saw the news about the Respect Rides program at the VA." "What about it?" James asked. "I'd like to help fund it," Robert replied. "My company has a charitable foundation, and after what happened, well, it feels like the right thing to do." James was silent for a moment, taken aback by the offer. "That's very generous," he said finally. "There's more," Robert continued. "I spoke with my board this morning. We'd like to establish a scholarship fund for children and grandchildren of Vietnam veterans. We're calling it the Forgotten Heroes Scholarship." Now James was truly speechless. "Mr. Wilson, are you still there?" "Yes," James managed. "I'm just surprised." "We'd like you to help us design the application criteria," Robert added. "Your perspective would be invaluable." Before James could respond, his doorbell rang again. With a sigh, he asked Robert to hold for a moment. Through the peephole, he was shocked to see Chuck Norris himself standing on his porch, accompanied by young Tom Baker and several other people. "I need to call you back," James told Robert hastily. "Something's come up." When James opened the door, Norris greeted him with a warm handshake. "Hope we're not intruding," Norris said. "But there's been some developments I thought you should know about in person rather than hearing it on the news." James invited them in, hurriedly clearing magazines from his living room sofa to make space for his unexpected guests. Besides Norris and Tom, there was Dr. Chen from the VA hospital and a woman James didn't recognize who carried a laptop under her arm. "This is Patricia Wright," Norris introduced the unknown woman. "She's my foundation's executive director." "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Wilson," Patricia said, shaking his hand. "We've had quite a morning." "So I've gathered," James replied. "Apparently we're viral, whatever exactly that means." Tom grinned. "It means awesome, sir. The video of Mr. Norris standing up for you has over 5 million views now. People are calling it the frozen train moment." Dr. Chen nodded. "And the response has been overwhelming. We've received over 1,000 volunteer applications for the Respect Rides program since the story aired last night. People from all over the country want to help." "And that's just the beginning," Patricia added, opening her laptop. "We've had donations pouring in for the service dog program Chuck mentioned. But more importantly, veterans are sharing their own stories of feeling invisible or disrespected. They're using the hashtag #NotForgotten. She turned the laptop toward James, showing him a social media page filled with photos of veterans of all ages, each with a short story attached. "It's become a movement overnight," Norris explained. "Veterans supporting each other, younger generations learning about their sacrifices, all because of what happened on that train." James shook his head in disbelief. "I don't understand. All I did was get pushed around a little." "No," Norris said firmly. "What you did was maintain your dignity in the face of disrespect. You showed grace when it would have been easy to respond with anger, and then you forgave. That's what people are responding to." Tom nodded eagerly. "My social media is blowing up with messages from kids my age wanting to know how they can get involved. They're asking their grandparents about their military service, some for the first time. And there's more," Dr. Chen added. "The mayor called this morning. The city wants to establish a Respect Our Veterans initiative, improving accessibility at public buildings and transportation hubs." James felt overwhelmed. He stood up and walked to the window, needing a moment to collect his thoughts. Outside, he was startled to see several news vans parked on his quiet street. "This is all moving so fast," he said, turning back to his guests. "I'm not sure I'm comfortable being the face of all this attention." Norris joined him at the window. "I understand that feeling," he said quietly. But sometimes a story takes on a life of its own because it touches something people need to hear. And you don't have to do anything you don't want to, Patricia assured him. We can handle the media and public aspects. We just wanted you to know what was happening and see if you'd like to be involved in any way that feels comfortable for you. James thought for a moment. Robert Keller, the businessman from the train, just called. He wants to fund the Respect Rides program and start a scholarship for veterans' families. Dr. Chen's eyes widened. That would be incredible. The funding we received yesterday will help launch the program, but long-term support would ensure it lasts. Maybe that's how I can help, James said slowly. Behind the scenes, working with veterans directly, not in front of cameras. Norris nodded approvingly. That sounds perfect. As they continued discussing possibilities, the doorbell rang again. This time it was Mrs. Powell holding a large casserole dish. I thought you might need some lunch with all these visitors, she explained, eyeing Chuck Norris with barely concealed excitement. And perhaps an extra set of hands to keep those reporters at bay. Within the hour, James's modest home had become an impromptu headquarters for what everyone was now calling the Respect Movement. Mrs. Powell had recruited several other neighbors to bring food and help screen visitors. Tom had set up a social media account specifically for veteran stories, with James providing guidance on the content. Robert arrived just after noon, initially apprehensive about facing Norris again, but was warmly welcomed into the planning session. His business expertise proved invaluable as they mapped out the scholarship program and long-term funding for Respect Rides. By evening, when the group finally dispersed, James found himself sitting alone in his living room, trying to process the day's events. His phone buzzed with a text from Tom. Just wanted to say thanks again, Mr. Wilson. My grandpa would have been proud to see this. See you tomorrow at the VA? James smiled as he texted back a simple, yes. 1 week later, James stood beside Chuck Norris at the official launch of the Respect Rides program. He had reluctantly agreed to say a few words, overcoming his discomfort with public speaking because he believed in the cause. What happened on that train could have ended very differently, James told the gathered crowd. It could have been just another moment of disrespect that goes unnoticed every day. Instead, it became a reminder that how we treat each other matters, especially those who have sacrificed for others. He gestured to where Tom stood with a group of young volunteers, all wearing Respect Rides t-shirts. And it's shown me that the younger generation does care. They just need to hear our stories and we need to be willing to share them. As James finished speaking, the first fleet of volunteer drivers, 50 cars strong, pulled up in front of the VA hospital. Each vehicle bore a small magnetic sign, Respect Rides driving our heroes. Robert Keller stepped forward to cut the ceremonial ribbon, his corporate foundation having provided not only funding, but also insurance coverage for all volunteer drivers. Beside him stood the elderly Korean War veteran from the train, now serving as an advisor to the program. Chuck Norris watched from the sidelines, content to let others take the spotlight. When a reporter asked him about his role in creating this movement, he shook his head. I just happened to be on the right train at the right time, he said. The real heroes are the veterans like James who serve with honor and continue to show courage every day long after they take off the uniform, and people like Robert who have the humility to learn and change. This isn't about me. Later, as the crowds dispersed, James found himself standing alone with Norris near the hospital entrance. Thank you, James said simply. Not just for what you did on the train, but for showing me that my story still matters. Norris placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. Our stories always matter, James. Sometimes we just need someone to listen. As they walked together toward a waiting Respect Rides vehicle, driven by none other than Tom Baker, James reflected on how a moment of humiliation had transformed into something so meaningful. The pain in his knee was still there, as were the memories of Vietnam, but something had shifted inside him. For 50 years he had carried his service quietly, almost apologetically in a country that had often seemed eager to forget. Now he had found a new mission, ensuring that no veteran felt forgotten or disrespected again. And it had all started because a man had stood up when it would have been easier to stay seated, proving that sometimes the greatest act of strength is simply showing respect for another human being. As Tom held the car door open for him, James touched the 101st Airborne pin on his lapel, a gesture that had become something of a habit. But now, instead of it being a private reminder of the past, it felt like a badge of present purpose. "Ready to go, Mr. Wilson?" Tom asked. James nodded, looking back at the hospital where 20 new veterans were already being paired with volunteer drivers. "Yes," he said with certainty. "I believe I am."